Our next speaker is Richard Lynn. Richard Lynn received BA, MA, and PhD degrees, all three in psychology from Cambridge. And as an undergraduate, he won the Passingham Prize for being the best psychology undergraduate student of that year. He taught at many universities and finished his academic career as the head of the psychology department at the University of Ulster in Ireland, of which he is now Professor Emeritus. I have probably read more nonfiction books by Richard Lynn than any other nonfiction author I can think of. And some of my favorites are Race Differences in Intelligence, Eugenics, a Reassessment, Dysgenics, IQ and the Wealth of Nations, and The Global Bell Curve. His latest book is it's called The Chosen People, a study of Jewish intelligence and achievements. As you can see just in the titles of his book, Richard Lynn has no fear of controversy. And I can tell you, I know of no one who has shown more dedication and more consistency, more effort in trying to throw light into the areas of darkness than Richard Lynn. If this difficult project of bringing sanity to a world that has gone insane ever succeeds, Professor Lynn will be recognized as the international treasure that he is. But in the meantime, I present to you Professor Lynn, who will speak about the prospects, eugenics and dysgenics, a promise denied. Please welcome Professor Lynn.
I'm sure all of you here are quite familiar with the meaning of the words dysgenics and eugenics, although I have found that among other well-informed people, although the word eugenics is quite well understood, many people are unfamiliar with the word dysgenics. The reason for this is that it very rarely appears in newspapers or in discussion. It is not even listed in the 2-volume Oxford Dictionary. And the reason it is so little known is that it is a profoundly politically incorrect concept, of which the axiom is that some people are better than others. Now, the ideas of eugenics and dysgenics were first advanced by Francis Galton in the 1860s and put out at greatest length in his book, Hereditary Genius, of 1869. And in that book, he argued that the populations of advanced countries, particularly that of Britain, of which he was, of course, a citizen, but also of other economically advanced countries, these populations were all declining genetically in 3 respects, namely those of health, intelligence, and what he called moral character, by which he meant a strong moral sense, a sense that one should work, one should make the best of one's talents, one should be honest, one should contribute to society, and a spectrum of characteristics of that kind. As far as the dysgenics of health is concerned, he argued that the causes of the degeneration were, first of all, the relaxation of natural selection against those with poor health. These were attributable, he thought, to improvements in public health, particularly the provision of pure drinking water and efficient sanitation. And this, the effect of these was that many children survived who would previously have died. Subsequently, it has been noted that medical improvements have increased genetic deterioration for health. And these consist, firstly, of surgical interventions which have preserved the lives of those who would otherwise have died and enable them to transmit their genes to later generations. The first of these was retinoblastoma, a hereditary cancer of the eye, and an American surgeon handled this problem in the first decade of the 20th century by removing the eyes of the affected patient. This cured the cancer. It was not then able to spread to other parts of the body, enabled the person, although now blind, to survive into adulthood and have children, thereby perpetuating the gene. And secondly, later in the 20th century, antibiotics also had a dysgenic effect. For instance, the commonest genetic disorder in European populations is cystic fibrosis. Those born with this condition used formerly to die quite early in life, in childhood or early adolescence. But today they can survive, thanks to antibiotics, to their late 30s or even their early 40s, enabling them to have children and transmit the genes. So much for the genetics of dysgenics of health. And now I come to the dysgenics of intelligence. Galton argued that there's been some relaxation of natural selection against those with low intelligence following the demographic transition. The first demographic transition consists of the replacement of populations with high fertility and high mortality, which has usually characterized human populations, with low fertility and low mortality. And during this transition, Galton argued that those who died formerly would be predominantly those of the lower intelligence. This gave rise to a negative association between intelligence and fertility. And the third dysgenic effect has been dysgenic immigration. Therefore, we are confronted with two dysgenic processes. First of all, dysgenic fertility, the tendency for intelligent people to have few children, and secondly, with the process of dysgenic immigration. Studies of the association between intelligence and fertility began to be carried out in the early 20th century following the development of intelligence tests, which made it moderately straightforward to test the intelligence of a larger sample of people past childbearing years from the mid-40s onwards, and ask them how many children they had. And those studies almost invariably found that intelligent people have fewer children and then less intelligent people, as Galton had some eyes. And we see here a recent study of data collected in 2004 in the United States. Here are all these correlations between IQ and IQ and fertility are negative, and so too are all the correlations of fertility with education, which is a function of a mix of IQ and strong moral character. And the correlations with education, as we'll see, are a little higher than those with IQ. Notice here that these correlations are greater among women than in men, and greater among blacks than among whites, so that the genetic quality of the population of blacks in the United States is deteriorating more rapidly than that of whites. Here I think you'll just see that observation summarized. And here is some recent data from Great Britain, collected only a few months ago, presented as those people who have children and those people who have not had children among these 47-year-olds. You'll see that men who have children have an IQ of 102, and those without children an IQ of 103. And women who have children have an IQ of 101.7, and those without children have an IQ of 103.5. Notice here again that the dysgenic phenomenon is stronger among women than among men. Now we look at the question of how this association, this negative association of fertility and intelligence has developed. And the principal causes are set out here. First of all, there was the invention of the rubber condom in 1865, which provided the first reliable form of contraception and was, as the leading historian of the condom, Ain Collier, wrote in her or him book, his 4 years ago, in every place these, the condoms, were generally used only by the middle and upper classes, due both to expense and lack of sex education. So we conclude that once this reliable form of contraception had been invented, dysgenic fertility became inevitable. It was inevitable that people who are intelligent and with high moral character would use contraception more efficiently than those without these qualities, and hence they would have fewer children. A second factor responsible for the dysgenics of our time is the emancipation of women. Continually over the last century or so, women have entered higher education and the professions. And these have low fertility. What typically happens with these high IQ young career women is that they devote their 20s to promoting their career. We know from Gallup polling type studies that these young women would like to have children, but not yet. They postpone having children until into their 30s, and then they frequently find that for various reasons they are perhaps not able to find Mr. Right, or they have become infertile because the fertility of women declines from their 30s onward. For various reasons, they find they are not able to have children. And so they enter the world quite frequently of IVF, which frequently is unsuccessful, and they end up childless. So we now have a situation where somewhere around a third of women graduates in their 40s are childless. And the third dysgenic force has been welfare. The growth of welfare for what may be called the underclass has grown. The generosity of welfare payments for the underclass has increased, permitting underclass young women who have low IQs and poor moral character and poor educational attainments and not much career prospects, permitting them to have children and to live on welfare. And a number of them have adopted this option. Now, the effect of dysgenic fertility has not been particularly great. It's calculated as a decline of genotypic intelligence, that is the genetic component of intelligence, of about 1 IQ point a generation. So that in itself is not a huge decline. But of course, this has persisted for some 6 generations from the 1860s, when Galton first identified it, up to the present, entailing a decline of around around 60 IQ points, which is quite an appreciable decline. This decline of genotypic intelligence has been compensated by an increase of phenotypic intelligence, known as the Flynn effect, which is that intelligence, as measured, has increased over much of the 20th century. This is due largely to improvements in health, nutrition, and possibly longer, for older age groups, education. However, this increase has now come to an end as the advantages of these environmental improvements have become exhausted, and declines of phenotypic intelligence, that is to say measured intelligence, have actually been recorded in Britain and Denmark from about 1990, and in other countries the increase of intelligence has ceased, including the United States, although not yet gone into decline. Now, hitherto I've spoken of dysgenic effects within countries. These correlations I've shown you are dysgenic effects within countries, but there's also been dysgenic effects over the entire world. Over the entire world, just as within countries, the intelligent people, as to say, the European peoples and the Northeast Asian peoples, have been having quite few children. In fact, the numbers of children produced in all these countries of Europe and Northeast Asia is below replacement. For replacement of the size of the population from generation to generation, each woman should produce 2 children. This is called a total fertility rate, TFR, of 2. There is no country inhabited by the European peoples or by the Northeast Asian peoples where total fertility rates are as high as 2. In fact, they range from 1 in Singapore to around 1.2 in a number of European countries, in the Baltic states, in the Czech Republic, to around 1.3 in Italy and Spain, 1.5 in Germany, and about 1.7 in Britain. And the total fertility rate of American Europeans is about 1.8. While the European peoples and the Northeast Asian peoples are having very few children, the peoples of the rest of the world are continuing to have large numbers of children. Around 4 or so in the, what you might call the moderately intelligent populations, which across North Africa, South Asia, and in much of Latin America, and up to natural fertility, so-called, of around 6 to 8 children in most of Sub-Saharan Africa. Natural fertility being number of children which a woman has without any form of contraception. Although there are just the beginnings of dysgenic fertility appearing in Sub-Saharan Africa as the professional classes have begun to reduce their fertility. So the most recent study of this phenomenon by Gerhard Meisenberg has found a correlation of 0.83 across all the nations in the world. That simply captures in the statistic this phenomenon, that the intelligent peoples are having few children, and he calculates a decline of the world's genotypic intelligence of 1.3 IQ points a generation. Now, dysgenic immigration will clearly have an effect of reducing the intelligence of the host populations that have to absorb these people. In the United States, there's been massive dysgenic immigration of Hispanics in particular, but also of other peoples with low IQs, blacks from the Caribbean and blacks from Africa, and some South Asians. And it has been calculated by the United States Census Bureau that the percentages of Europeans in the population in the United States will be about 45% in the year 2050. And it's quite easy to calculate what the IQ of the population will be then, giving the European peoples an IQ of 100, the Hispanics an IQ of 89, it has been found in many studies, and the blacks an IQ of 85. If those figures are multiplied out, you get an IQ in the United States of 92 in that year. And this dysgenic immigration is not confined by any means to the United States, although the United States is the furthest advanced in this downward trajectory. The same thing has been happening in Britain, where it has been calculated by David Coleman, the professor of demography at Oxford, that the indigenous British people will be 50% of the population in the year 2066. About 56% of the population, he does these projections for various years in the future. The Europeans in Britain will be down to 56% of the population, and we can calculate likewise that the IQ will fall to about 95. The same thing has been happening throughout Western Europe. There's been massive dysgenic immigration of North Africans into France and Sub-Saharan Africans from Africa, from their former colonies in West Africa and in the Caribbean, and in the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Germany. So the intelligence of the populations will fall in throughout Western Europe in the decades that lie ahead. These are the factors responsible for the diminishing proportion of whites in the population. The below replacement fertility of whites, the high fertility of the non-Europeans who are colonizing European countries. In the United States, the fertility of Hispanics is about 2.8, and the fertility of blacks is about 2.2, and the fertility of whites is around 1.7 to 1.8. So we have the below replacement fertility of Europeans, the high fertility of non-Europeans. In Britain, some of the non-European immigrants have fertility rates of 5. This is true of the Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and of the Somali populations. And the effective fertility of the Bangladeshis and Pakistanis is even higher because of the arranged marriages. Most marriages of young people in the Pakistani and Bangladeshi populations are arranged with partners on the subcontinent. They marry someone on the subcontinent, and this person then has the right of abode in Britain, and they're brought into Britain. So for every 5 children that are produced by these families, more or less another 5 come into the country, producing the effective total fertility rate of 9, or a little less. So we have continuing and probably unstoppable immigration of non-Europeans throughout the economically developed European peoples, and hence a continuing decline of our population, the IQ of our population. Galton, as I mentioned at the beginning, also proposed there has been a decline of moral character. People with high moral character are also having fewer children than people of lower moral character. And this also appears to be the case, though the evidence for it is somewhat less strong. We know, for example, that criminals have greater fertility than non-criminals. And we know that across the world, moral character is strongest in the European and Northeast Asian peoples than it is in the rest of the world. This is found in the corruption index an index constructed by some people which provides a measure for the level of corruption in all countries in the world. This shows that corruption is quite low in Europe and in Northeast Asia, and much higher in the rest of the world. So the same thing is happening for moral character as is happening for intelligence. So I will not repeat the points I made with regard to intelligence for moral character. Now, eugenics is the solution Galton proposed to dysgenics. Dysgenics really comes first. That is the problem. Eugenics is the solution. And so Galton argued, well, we're in a situation of genetic decline, and we must try to correct this. And for this, he proposed the word eugenics in 1883. And he spent the last 28 years or so of his life trying to formulate policies that would have eugenic effects. And this was taken up in the first decade of the 20th century by many thinking people, virtually all thinking people, as Robert Feinberg reminded us in the first presentation this morning. Virtually all thinking people in the first decade of the 20th century thought Galton's analysis was correct. And the solutions he proposed of trying to correct this was also correct. And various measures were taken to attempt to correct this. The first of these, well, answers Galton in formulating policies for eugenics, distinguish between negative eugenics and positive eugenics. Positive eugenics consists of programs designed to persuade intelligent people to have more children. And negative eugenics consists of programs designed to persuade less intelligent people and people of weaker moral character to have fewer children. That is the general framework for eugenic policies. And as I was observing, many people thought this was sensible and tried to formulate actual policies that would have these effects. The positive eugenics policies consisted of financial incentives for intelligent and young people and those of sound moral character to have children, to better their lives so that they could afford to have more children. This was taken up by Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, the Prime Minister for many years, who is the only prominent politician in the second half of the 20th century who was greatly concerned with this problem and articulated his concern. And he introduced various financial incentives for graduates to have more children or to have some children without having very much effect. The most promising development of positive eugenics, which lies in the future rather than the present, is that of embryo selection. This procedure consists of a couple producing a number of embryos as they are produced for IVF, in vitro fertilization. And these embryos can be assessed for their genetic qualities. And those that are deemed the most desirable embryo of the number that are grown is selected and implanted. This technology is carried out at the moment for, certainly in Britain and possibly here and elsewhere, to select girls rather than boys when the couple are likely to have a child with a sex-linked genetic disorder which appears only in males, the most well-known and commonest of which is a defect of blood clotting, which you die if not treated, haemophilia. In these circumstances in Britain, a couple can have the process carried out, and the female is implanted. However, this is not permitted for any other reasons. You're not allowed to use this procedure if you just happen to want a girl or want a boy. This is perhaps rather curious for those of us who believe we live in a free society where people should be allowed to choose whatever course of action they like, as long as this does not cause social damage. So some may say, well, if people want a girl or a boy, why shouldn't they be allowed to have one? Doesn't seem anything wrong with that. There's no special reason why to suppose that this will cause any social harm. Most people would like to have 2 children, one of each sex. So if they have a boy and want a girl, the next one, well, why not? Anyhow, however, it is illegal in Britain and throughout Europe, and I should imagine in the United States. Now, in the future, this will probably become available to assess these embryos genetically, not merely for their sex, but for their intelligence and their moral character. As the genes for these become identified, as inevitably they will, these embryos will be assessed for their intelligence and their moral character, and perhaps for other things. So then the doctor will be able to say to the couple, well, here are the printouts of all these embryos, which one do you want us to implant? Most people would like to have intelligent children and children of sound moral character. So this will inevitably come to be used, and this will have, if it's used on a large scale, a very considerable eugenic effect. Most couples produce children with a wide range of intelligence, as is known from everyday experience. Siblings are not all that closely similar for intelligence. In many cases, one sibling will have a high intelligence and one a substantially lower intelligence. So if couples are able to implant the ones with high intelligence, well, then the IQ of the population will increase considerably. This will probably be taken up initially only by small numbers of people, as is the case with any new technological invention. Initially, it's taken up by a few who can afford it, but eventually it trickles down, and everyone, or most people, use this product. And the same can be anticipated for embryo selection, though rather slowly, because probably its illegality will be retained, and so nevertheless, clinics will be set up somewhere in the world which will carry out this procedure, and some couples will go to them to have it done. Now we come to negative eugenics. The most obvious of these, which was introduced in many countries in the first half of the 20th century, is sterilization of the mentally retarded and criminals. Compulsory sterilization was first introduced in the state of Indiana in 2007, and subsequently was introduced in about 30 states of the Union by around 1930. The critical legal case concerning compulsory sterilization was that of Buck versus Bell, where Carrie Buck was a young mentally retarded woman who had had a child who was assessed as mentally retarded. Her mother was mentally retarded, and this it was appealed against people who didn't approve of sterilizing the mentally retarded. It went up eventually to the Supreme Court, who refused the appeal in this famous case, and the judge responsible for delivering the verdict declined the appeal with the memorable phrase, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." William Shockley, produced the famous Nobel Prize winner for physics turned eugenicist, suggested a modification of this proposal, of this measure, that we could offer financial incentives to those with IQs below 100 to be sterilized. He proposed they could be offered $1,000 for each point below, each IQ point below 100. So someone with an IQ of 99 could have $1,000, and someone with an IQ of 70 could have $30,000. But it's not an IU, it's not a proposal which is taken off. Negative eugenics can also be achieved by restrictions on immigration and by the repatriation of illegal immigrants. However, all these things are very difficult to achieve. Oh, finally, yes. Well, I maybe talk about that in a minute or two. All these things are in practice very difficult to achieve. Sterilizing the mentally retarded, even if you sterilized around 1% of them, which was the greatest number who were sterilized in Sweden, the Germans sterilized about 0.5% of the population, has very, very little effect on the intelligence of succeeding generations. All these things are very hard to achieve. Paying intelligent women to have more children, but denying these payments to less intelligent women, this is very hard to achieve. Repatriation is attempted in many countries, but is very hard to achieve. Now, I finally conclude by having some comments on the likely future of dysgenics and eugenics. Considering first the European peoples, it looks as if the European peoples will continue their downward trajectory. Dysgenic fertility has been with us for 6 generations and is still present. It is unlikely that this will end. High IQ young career women will continue to have low fertility. The migration of third world peoples into European populations in North America and in Western Europe will continue, pulling down the IQ of the new populations. This will very likely spread to Eastern Europe later in the century, as the United States, Canada, and Western Europe become successively less attractive places as the United States. The single largest group become Mexicans. The population will become like Mexico. This will be a less attractive place for Mexicans to enter. Why should they wish to enter the new Mexican United States? They might as well stay at home. But they will turn, third world immigrants looking for higher standards of living will turn to Eastern Europe. So I see the future in rather pessimistic terms for the European peoples. Possibly it might be solved by secession in the United States of some of the northern states. Maine and Vermont, perhaps, might declare independence from the Union. And the same might take place in some of the northeastern states, in perhaps Montana or North and South Dakota. The populations of these states might, considering as they see the rest of the states being overwhelmed by immigrants, might opt for secession from the Union and have developed their own European populations with very strict immigration control. The third world is also on a downward trajectory. Dysgenic fertility has just begun, and they will also be adversely affected by dysgenic immigration as elites from the third world migrate into the first world. The Northeast Asians will be less severely affected by these processes. They have some dysgenic fertility, but this will very likely in time be overcome by embryo selection. They do not have any dysgenic immigration and are unlikely to have it in the foreseeable future. China, in particular, will probably be the most successful of these countries because it does not have the handicap of being a democratic country. I don't believe that the dysgenic problem can be overcome in democracies. And China has a big advantage in this regard, that it could introduce policies such as paying high sums of money to female graduates to have children but not to the rest of the population. They can introduce policies of this kind, which would be unacceptable in democracies. China also has one considerable advantage arising as an unforeseen consequence of the one-child policy. The consequence of this has been that many couples restricted to one child who have had a girl have killed her and hope to produce a boy. The consequence of the one-child family has been that many couples would prefer to have a boy than a girl. And they have secured this objective. So there are many more young men in China than there are young women. Now, this could have a significant eugenic effect because it places power in the hands of women to select men. Women who select men as their mates and marriage partners generally select men who are intelligent, successful, and of high moral character. So the effect of this will be effectively to sterilize around 23% of the male population. This is really talking as compared with sterilizing 1% of the population in Sweden in the 1930s, or 0.5% of the population in Germany. When you're talking about sterilizing 23% of the male population, this will have a considerable eugenic effect. So, call this a pessimistic or an optimistic scenario. My view of the probable future is that while the genetic quality of the European populations declines, that of China will increase together with her economic and military power. And to conclude on a note of qualified optimism, I think it's probable that the torch of civilization will pass from the European peoples to the Chinese. Thank you.
Richard, you said that the prospects are quite dim for a eugenic state to arise in a democracy. Do you think that in some ways politics need to be changed in order for us to overcome this dysgenic disaster that we're living through? The politics come first in that sense?
I do. The question was, I asserted that I think it is impossible for serious eugenic policies to be introduced in a democracy. The tide of liberal opinion is too strong against them. Although most people were in favor of eugenics in the first half of the century, the 20th century, the tide has turned very strongly against it in the second half up to the present day. Only some form of oligarchy, authoritarian oligarchy, such as that in China, or possibly a military dictatorship, could introduce serious eugenic policies.
Yes, in China now, with the one-child policy, the preponderance of men over women, young men over women, that's true, they can select their better mate, but this also has implications for social instability, this great number of young men without mates. Do you think that might perhaps adversely affect China's chances for a world dominance?
Yeah. Yes, the question is this sex ratio in China, 1.23 men to 1 woman, may well have adverse consequences as you have a lot of discontented young men who are not able to find partners. Of course, these will be the least intelligent, so they may not have much clout in making nuisances of themselves. Nevertheless, I haven't seen any sign of this in China yet, although, of course, there are protests in China have been growing in these last few years. Difficult to estimate how serious a problem this will be for the Chinese oligarchy.
This question is a little bit similar to Richard Spencer's, but yeah, you stated that it would be difficult for policies to be enacted in a democracy. But what about private non-profits for positive eugenics? Like Susan G. Komen's Race for the Cure, What about Richard Lynn's cure for the race?
Can you repeat the last point? What about?
Just like Susan G. Komen's Race for the Cure, what about Richard Lynn's cure for the race? Non-profit positive eugenics, not policies.
There might be some non-profit organizations which could introduce some of these eugenic policies. They were done by Colonel Draper, who set up the Pioneer Fund in the 1930s. His first measure was to produce financial incentives to aircraft officers who he thought was the most desirable people genetically in the population. He offered bursaries for these people to have more than 2 children. But it didn't have very much effect. The problem is you have to give, it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of inconvenience to rear a child. To have more children than you would really want as a result of the incentive, a financial incentive, requires a massive financial incentive to induce people to take up this option. So I don't really have any confidence that this could have any effect.
Do you have an opinion on the claim that legalizing abortion has caused crime to decline in the United States?
Yes, there were some economists who calculated that the availability of abortion in the United States, which I think became effective in 1973, that this had an advantageous eugenic effect in that a lot of fetuses of the criminal classes, the underclass and so forth, were being aborted, who formerly were born and entering the population. And he demonstrated that this was the case, that crime had declined in subsequent years from this 1973 innovation. And it seems to make sense. And I guess he's correct about this.
If you were to migrate to an American Indian reservation, such as the Comanche or the Navajo, and you wanted to become a member of that nation, you couldn't. You wouldn't be allowed. How is it that every country in the world these days has open doors? Anybody can move and live anywhere they want. This is an unwritten document somewhere that everybody has the right to do this. How is that going to be changed?
Well, this is a very interesting question. And the number of the question is, how is it that we, particularly, we Europeans, have said to all the world, come in and live with us. It's nice here. You'll be much happier here than in your own countries. How has this happened? It seems to be against nature to invite alien peoples to come and share your homeland. I think we have become too nice. We've become too nice. And I think the increasing niceness of the European peoples goes back about 200 years. One of the, you can sketch out landmarks of our increasing niceness. One of them was in the year 1807, when we, the British, abolished the slave trade. People began to say, well, this isn't really right. So we should, up to from the 16th through to 1800, people thought there's nothing wrong with the slave trade. But about the year 1800, people began to say, well, this is wrong. And this act was introduced, abolishing the trade. And we abolished slavery itself as an institution in 1834, and all other Europeans, peoples abolished both the trade and the institution in subsequent years, including here, of course, in about the year 1865. This is part of our nicer. We've become nicer in all sorts of respects. We pay people who are unfortunate welfare payments. In many countries, we've abolished executing murderers. In all these respects, we've become too nice for our own good. So that is my answer to that question.
Dr. Lynn, you've written a book on the high IQ of Jews, especially Ashkenazic Jews. I wonder, when you go back in our own history, it's impossible to measure the IQ of whites in antiquity. But you look at a place like ancient Athens, where popular entertainment consisted of the Greek plays, which now only a minority of college students in European countries can understand. But you had olive pickers and people like that going to these plays. Is there any thoughts you have about the possibility that the other white peoples, other than the Jews, had a similar IQ, but that this dysgenic effect has been going on more than 6 generations, maybe not as quite the clip that it's acquired now, but that we have maybe lost 10 IQ points since antiquity?
It is very probable that the IQ of the Greeks from the classical times has declined substantially. Galton estimated the IQ of the classical Greeks at 120 in relation to an IQ of 100 for the English, and of 79 for Sub-Saharan Africans, and of 69 for Australian Aborigines. And he was very close to the mark for the IQs of Sub-Saharan Africans and Australian Aborigines, and very likely he was pretty close to the mark for the classical Athenians. The IQ in Greece today is about 92. So we've had massive dysgenic effects in Greece from over the last 2.5 centuries. Probably this is due to dysgenic immigration. And what the classical Greeks did, first of all, they killed a lot of each other in these repeated warfares, but they replaced their population by liberating slaves who had come from elsewhere. And subsequently, Greece was occupied by the Turks for around 5 centuries, from somewhere around 1400 to somewhere around 1900. And during that time, there must have been dysgenic mating between native Greeks and Turks. So the IQ has gone down very considerably. So we've seen it all before in the case of classical Greece. And you've seen all of the adverse effects of dysgenic immigration in this particular case.
Quick technical question. In your talk about the degradation of genotypic component of IQ over generations, you said there was a correlation coefficient of 0.83 or 0.73 of IQ with something, but it wasn't clear to me what it was being correlated with.
That is the correlation between measured intelligence
and
numbers of children.
Ah, okay.
Your final statement caught my attention. Considering that it's a repressive police state radically different from the Western tradition, do you really think it's an optimistic note to think of, quote, the torch of civilization being passed to the Chinese?
Well, I use the phrase qualified optimism. What would happen if China didn't exist? Then we'd be really pessimistic, because all the rest of the economic developed world all of these countries have democracies. And as I've said, I don't think the dysgenic problem can be solved in a democracy. So if civilization is to continue at all, even in China, and the option is the extinction of civilization elsewhere in the world, I'd rather have it survive in China.
Professor, when you mentioned the Bell case, recently a book came out which received the accolades from the usual suspects, talking about how the dysgenic effects were overestimated, that the results of these IQ tests were inaccurate and stuff like that, and specifically that there was false evidence introduced by the state to sterilize what they termed the unfit. Have you looked into that at all as far as the facts of the case were?
Well, this was all challenged by the late lamented Stephen Jay Gould. who always put his ideology before his science. And he wrote an essay on this case. He said he'd visited Carrie Buck. He found she was reading a low-level newspaper. So he thought she can't be mentally retarded at all. Of course, people with an IQ of 70 or 65 are quite capable of reading newspapers, as long as they're not too complex ones. And he said, oh, this was given by an old-fashioned intelligence test. Well, intelligence tests have barely changed from their first construction in around 1915 up to the present day. So I don't attach any credence to this. And I say Stephen Jay Gould was up to his usual tricks and falsifying the evidence in favor of his own ideology.
I'll ask 3 real short questions. The difference between male and female IQs. I've read some contradictory stuff. One is that they're the same, and I read in the History of the Pioneer Fund that there was a 4-point difference. If you could comment on that. Also, the Japanese conundrum. I've heard morality correlated with IQ several times today. Maybe I should ask Jared that, but being the Japanese expert, but the Japanese are known to be pretty humble servants, incredibly, and vicious masters. The Nanking issue, World War II, we know how they are in battle, but yet they're incredibly low rates of incarceration and so forth. So that I see a huge conundrum with the Japanese. I've never been able to wrap my mind around. So I'll just leave it at that if you could answer those 2.
As far as the first question is concerned regarding the sex differences, I have been atypically controversial in maintaining that men have a higher IQ than women, and by around 4 IQ points, as you correctly say. This was never noted before I ventured to advance this theory, because the male advantage doesn't appear till around the age of 16 or 17. There's no difference between the sexes, except in spatial abilities, up to the age of 16 or 17. So there's a huge amount of data showing there's no sex difference in intelligence based on children aged 15 to 16. So everyone said, no, there's no sex difference in intelligence. The thing that interested me got me interested in this question, was a paper published by Phil Rushton and a colleague, which showed that men have larger brains than women, even when you can control for body size. And a large brain confers greater intelligence. So this implies that because men have larger brains than women, you certainly expect they should have a higher intelligence than women. And when I examined the data of adults, as apart from children, I found that this was so. And I've done quite a lot of papers on this and put a lot of studies together. And I believe that is the case. And this explains the William Summers comment that perhaps there aren't very many very high-level physicists and mathematicians among women. I think he put it, I don't think he used the phrase because they're less intelligent than men, but he did suggest that perhaps they don't have the aptitude for these particular subjects, which cost him his job as president of Harvard University. As for your second question regarding the Japanese, well, I maintain they have a strong moral character despite their cruelty in certain circumstances, such as their treatment of prisoners in World War II and so forth. Nevertheless, the Japanese are very law-abiding people. They have very low levels of crime. Japanese Americans, together with Chinese Americans, have very low levels of crime. All these things point, I think, to this conclusion that the Japanese, as with other Northeast Asian peoples, are a people with strong moral character.